Oh, what is this? Am I hearing? It is another quarterly Q&A live with me and Seb. That picture looks a lot like Seb and nothing like me. But thank you everyone for joining me and Seb. Seb, good morning to you.
Good morning, Jeff. And Jeff, by the way, you are sharing the wrong screen.
Again.
Again, same as yesterday.
Screen 2. Ta-da! Screen 2. So,
Nope. Yes.
we
Okay.
are going to cover some deeply interesting topics that we've received over the past 3 months. Some of them are relatively new because of some of the innovations we've had in the product. Some probably could go back years, but they're just fascinating. People asked about them, and why would we only tell that answer to the one person who asked it? We want to share with everybody. So let's talk about the agenda. What will we discuss? So we're going to start by talking about debugging intuiface experiences. Power users are always asking, is there a way to kind of reverse engineer how things are working to see why something is not working? And Seb has got some really good tips. There's no better power user. So he's debugging stuff all the time. He's going to give you some insight into how he does that. Then we'll move on to working with the Headless CMS base and knowing when it has synchronized completely. If I start a new experience, it doesn't have to be new experience, but if I launch an experience, one of the first things it does is make sure the local copy of the Headless CMS base is synchronized with the cloud-hosted master. How do you know when that's done? Because if you just start right away, maybe it hasn't finished synchronizing and you're missing content or the wrong content. So how do you know? So Seb will give you some insight into that. Then we'll move on to a cool little design technique for creating an interactive scroll bar for a collection. So not manipulating the collection directly, but somehow externally manipulating a collection. How can you create that sort of thing? Link that external design element to a collection to manipulate it. And Seb has some cool insight on that. And then,
AKA,
yeah.
AKA a slider.
A slider, AKA a slider. And for you New Englanders, we don't mean a sub or hoagie. We mean the thing that you slide. And then you'll actually hear from me. We will shift over to licensing, which could put some people to sleep, but it's the only thing that costs money. So you should stay awake. As you well know, hopefully you well know, with Player Next Gen, you can deploy experiences to the web. When deploying to the web, you need to have a licensing consideration. What kind of license are you going to use? Because there's two choices. It's not just one choice. We call them views licensing and player licensing, and I will help you understand the difference. Why would you pick one over the other? So that's today's agenda. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, most of you are veterans of GoToWebinar. You know there's a questions panel in the GoToWebinar toolbar. When Seb is speaking, I'm going to monitor it. When I'm speaking, Seb is going to monitor it. We will type answers in line in real time. And at the conclusion of each agenda item, we will also open up the floor to questions for a couple of minutes before moving on to the next topic. So at the end of the day, Seb and I, we know what we're talking about. It's making sure that you know what we're talking about. So if you have any questions, do not be shy. That being said, Seb, unless there's something else to cover, I think we can get going.
Yeah, let's go. So I'm gonna switch presenter to myself and show my screen, and when you PC, bear with me. Hopefully that's the right one. All right, Jeff, you can see my screen?
I believe so. I see our logo, but I believe that's your screen, yes.
Yes, it is. All right, so the first topic we're gonna cover is debugging or troubleshooting. And this, as you can imagine, helping the support team at Interface, being the customer success manager for Interface, I'm doing this every single day. With experience I have not built. But even when we ourselves, the Interface team, we build some experiences, don't get me wrong, we don't always get it right the first time we try. When you create a trigger that is supposed to call an action, and the example I'm going to show first is with Nextmosphere sensors, you don't always know all the commands on top of your head. So you need to troubleshoot what's going wrong or why it just doesn't do what it should do. So these are techniques that might come from my developer background. You definitely don't need to be a developer to use these techniques. It's more little things that will help you understand what's going on and why something that should do what you want doesn't. So the first example I'm going to show you here is about with the Nextmosphere. So I have my Nextmosphere board here, right next to me. I'm going to press a button, and of course, if this is not going to work. So you see the two little text I have on the right-hand side here on the side, nothing's happening. I did already put some debugging tools. So if I press my space bar here, I have my Nextmosphere default design accelerator, you know, the thing that comes with Nextmosphere that pops up. And this actually tells me some messages. Port COM1 does not exist. So probably I'm using the wrong port. That's a good place to start. This will tell me that, okay, this is wrong. I need to go into my device manager on Windows, find out that on my COM port, this is actually COM4. Okay, let's switch that. COM4, enter, connect. Now, if I press my button one, what do I get? I do get some commands. So you can see, use my mouse here, this one gets white. If I release the button, this one gets back to gray, and I see some commands. If I press the other one, although nothing happens, and you have to trust me, I'm pressing two different buttons down there. I can see now in the logs here that I'm getting these commands with the 17 or the 3. It might be a little bit small on your screen, but you have to believe me, these two are different commands. So 3 is button number 1, 17 is button number 2. I can then go back into my experience and change that, which I'm going to do. So I'm going to go back in edit mode and then talk about how did I bring this panel in? What's the technique for that? So first of all, if I look at my Nextmosphere, I have my triggers on this screen. This is command 3, this is okay. I actually put 7 instead of 17, so I'm just going to switch that and everything's going to work again. So the technique I use is, first of all, to use either a dedicated layer if everything happens in one scene, or an experience layer if you need to troubleshoot across multiple scenes in your experience, to put my debug content. So this panel here is in this debug layer. Why am I doing that? First of all, I can just hide the whole thing, and then my experience is almost ready to go. At the end of production, when everything has been tested and validated, I can go back into the experience and just delete that layer, and it cleans my experience. It removes all my dev tools or production tools that I don't need anymore in production. So it's a good way to organize what is necessary to your experience versus what is additional help, additional tools to help you with that. So I could have just put this in the scene, right? But it's pretty big, bulky, and it covers the whole stuff. So instead, what I'm doing is I put this outside of the scene, and then I have a toggle button, which I could put inside, which is when it's checked, it moves my panel inside. When it's unchecked, it moves my panel outside. And that's totally fine. So toggle button to use these two actions to actually show the debug tools. You could do hide and show as well. You don't have to use move to, it's just personal preference. That's completely fine. And this button will have to be always visible if you want it to be able to click on that. Again, once you're done with debugging, just hide your layer. It hides your toggle button and your debug text content, and you're good to go. One more thing which I like to do when I'm sending this experience, like for example, this something with Nextmosphere, I would send to our friends at Nextmosphere and they would test it on their Brightsen player for let's say Infocom show 2 weeks ago. They don't need to see that button, and I don't know yet if everything's working as expected on their end. So I would just put the button outside of the scene again, and then use a keyboard trigger. I like to use the spacebar because it's just easy, which will toggle the state of my button. So I'm going to put this button back here in the scene, hit play so you can see what I'm talking about. First of all, if I test again, this doesn't work because I forgot to change the COM port in here. So let me put COM4. So button 2, button 1, the triggers are working. You may have seen the text going white. If I click that, sorry, that button, my panel comes in. If I click again, my panel comes out. Instead of using this visible button, wherever I am, there's no focus question here. If I just press the spacebar key on my keyboard, it checks the button, thus brings the debug panel in screen. If I press again, so it's really like a light switch on off. It's very convenient. I can hide this button. I know this command, like expert command, press the spacebar. Sometimes I would just use the D keystroke, so D as debug, if spacebar is used for something else, maybe. And that's a very useful way to add additional information to help you understand what's going on. The second thing, which is very similar, right, is to use either global variables and or text assets to actually visualize what you're trying to deal with, what is the data you are working with. In our first example here, we had these logs which come by default, right? With Nextmosphere, just drag and drop this thing, it creates this panel with all the texts. And in the end, what really helped me was this text here, which is bound to the activity log property of Nextmosphere. Okay, so I'm going to take another example here because I have a second group with a clock. Let's say you want to use the clock, but you want to display it in the format that you or your customer prefers. And you're not 100% sure of what that format should be. So when you create a text, let's say this one is my date to display, and you are trying to mess around with this date format. And you don't always know what the parameters are. You don't remember exactly what is the full date. I added here an additional text field showing me the full date, the ISO time. So, okay, this is the data I'm starting from. This is my result. Until I have the right result displayed here, I'm going to keep this text visible so I know what I'm using as my binding input and what is the result of my conversion, of my date format converter. So I have the two values visible at the same time, and I know what I'm dealing with. This is a simple example with the date format. If you're dealing with, again, a lot of data flow, like data coming from an API, from a sensor, from the commands, displaying visually this in like a box like this on the corner, so it is visible to you while you're working on the experience, is really helpful to understand what's going on. And again, once you're done, either you just move this outside, or you hide it, or you use the same mechanism with a toggle button to hide and show it if you're not done just yet. So these are the two components, I would say, of my troubleshooting process, or I should say our support and CSM team troubleshooting process, adding this extra layer or experience layer to put visual aids, visual helpers to truly understand what is going on and make sure that you can easily clean your experience afterwards or dynamically hide and show these help tools, these helping assets to help you make progress in your experience. I think that's it for this one. Jeff, I haven't seen, did we get any questions on this? Or I think it's pretty straightforward, but let me know, guys.
Straightforward, no questions. I will remind folks, it's the questions panel in the GoToWebinar toolbar. I took some notes, Seb, a couple small points and questions. For people that are not familiar with layers, just be aware, Seb happened to call it debug layer. He could have called it Seb's RV. I mean, you can give them any name you want. There's nothing special about that name. And this is certainly implied and stated by Seb, but let's reiterate, you can create your own debug panel. It just so happens Nextmosphere's, our interface asset for Nextmosphere has a debug panel associated with it, essentially. But the idea is build your own. Think about the steps of the scenario you're trying to build, and then to somehow display those steps in your debug panel so you can kind of troubleshoot when things are going wrong. So there's some creativity there. You're building this thing that your clients may never see. It's for you entirely. Right, Seb?
Yeah, it is, and that's a good point. I just tried to show two examples, one with the sensors because you don't control the data that comes in. especially when you deal with a present sensor or distant sensor, the data keeps going around. The clock is way more simple. Somewhere in between an example or a use case I've seen before where I needed to add some information to understand exactly what our customer was trying to do is the text concatenation. When you have this IA, this interface asset with up to 12 inputs, and let's say this is a hello, and then this comes from a text input, this comes from the weather, this comes from the clock. You need to understand exactly where all the data is coming from. So displaying all these fields in the screen helped me to understand, okay, which one was failing. By the way, the use case was to build a nice email template to send via the share via email. So being able to split all the steps between the original inputs and the expected result to figure out, okay, what's going wrong somewhere in between really helps.
Yeah, and although I think Intuiface might be the greatest software product on the planet, it is not totally perfect. You cannot, for example, set a watch on a sequence of trigger and actions and follow it through the sequence of triggers and actions. You're going to have to proactively create these visual tools to track that process and break down what's going on. But keep this in mind.
Right, it's not a dev environment. We don't have breakpoints. We don't have watchers. So you have to create your own watchers, which will be this text bound to the data that matters. And you have to create your own breakpoints by, when you have a trigger, display the intermediate value in a text to actually see that value.
And maybe even don't allow the sequence to execute to completion. Force breakpoints, right?
Yeah.
And then build something that says, okay, go to the next step. Okay, go to the next step. You have to clean it up when you're done. But if it gets complicated, look, if you're building simple things, we always talk about crawling, walking, and running with Intuiface. Everything we just talked about, you do not need if you're crawling with Intuiface. It's simple. What you're building does not need to be debugged. It's when you get a little more advanced with interface assets, more complex trigger action pairs, and
APIs.
Sequences, maybe doing something with APIs and interface assets. That's when you need to start considering this as the complexity ramps up.
Or another thing which actually just happened this morning, one of your longtime employees left your company and you have no idea how he built the experience. And then you have to reverse engineer his work. And then you contact our support team and we try to help as much as we can. And that's the techniques that we use ourselves.
To reverse engineer the debugging, to kind of walk it back. Seb, that's great. Thank you very much. I don't see any questions, but again, folks, don't be shy. Type them in there. We'll move on to the next topic, which is about how do you know when the local copy of a headless CMS base has completed its synchronization, that it's safe to move ahead. In fact, can you somehow wait for it and not allow the experience to proceed until the synchronization has finished? Anybody using the headless CMS is going to really need to know how to do this. So go ahead, Seb.
Yes, this is pretty important because we've seen obviously more and more of our users starting to use the headless CMS and coming back to us with I just launched my experience and I see a blank screen, or I see a missing image icon. And for sure, because all your content is on the CMS, it's on the cloud, and it needs to be downloaded first before being able to be played, in most cases, at least for the images and some videos. So the big recommendation that I try to use when I build projects myself for the marketplace, on when we talk to our customers who are building projects with the headless CMS, is every HCMS-based project should use the sync triggers, the synchronization triggers, to make sure you have some kind of loading stage. And if this is not automatic, right? Because maybe there are some cases where you don't want to wait, and that's okay. That's fine. But again, 90+% of the cases, an interface project is running on a kiosk, on the wall, in some kind of public environment, and you launch it in the morning when nobody's using it. So if it takes a few seconds or minutes to load all the content, it's better than if you're trying to display the content before it's actually here, actually available. So how do you do that? On every single Headless CMS base you will have in an experience, you will get a bunch of triggers. These triggers are sync started, sync failed, if you're launching an experience without an internet connection, for example, and sync completed. Personally, I only use the sync completed. Again, for some debugging, I might use the sync started to make sure that the sync actually started. Or if I have some cases where I need to sync on a regular basis while the experience is running, that's kind of specific. But to stay on the general use case, I would use this sync completed. And then in my experience, I have either an initial scene, which would be my loading scene, or a particular experience layer, which is on top of everything else, which says loading content, please wait. And this can be as simple as what I did here, or as fancy as a lot of apps nowadays are displaying text which rotates between launch, preparing rocket fuel, or aligning stars, or whatever funny message you want to display here. So you could use a swap collection and put some fun stuff here. The point is, when you get that sync completed, then you either navigate to your true home scene, or just hide the loading layer, which I did here because I wanted to keep everything in a single scene. And then in my case, I wanted to play a video, and I just added a delay so you could see that, because obviously I have already launched this experience before, so I have all the cache locally on my machine. So the sync for me is going to take a fraction of a second. So using this trigger is a good practice. I almost want to say it's a must do. Actually, I can't really think of a case where you shouldn't do it. It adds this one little extra step, as opposed to if you were using an Excel file, maybe in the past with interface. But that's the kind of a compromise of having the content being uploaded, managed in the Headless CMS in a browser by somebody else from the team who knows nothing about Composer, who doesn't need to deal with an Excel file, versus having an Excel and all the files already local, where when you have it, all your content in an Excel file, your project gets pretty big because all the content is within the project. So you have to push the whole project before you can actually play it. Moving this content outside of Excel to the Headless CMS removes this big size of a project that needs to be deployed, but that doesn't change the size of your project. If your medias are still big, they still need to be downloaded before they are actually played on the player. So make sure you use this step, whether it's a scene, whether it's a layer. Sync is completed is a trigger you should consider adding to your experience as soon as you're using an HCMS base. There's not much more to say here. It's really just a good practice I want to spread around.
Yeah, I think it's once people see it, I think it's pretty straightforward. It does beg a couple questions. The first is, on subsequent launches, is it faster? Is it differential? Does it know what's already there, so it launches faster the second, third time than it does the first time?
Yes, definitely. And that's why I've seen users, before using Headless CMS, right, using some kind of APIs with a third-party CMS, Airtable, for example. Instead of doing this, they would put a timer on the experience like 30 seconds, which is truly arbitrary. I mean, why not 20? Why not 40? Sometimes, depending on the amount of data you have to download from a third-party CMS or from the Headless CMS, it can take a few seconds, a few minutes. I've seen projects with an HCMS base of 10 gigabytes. With my cellular connection, I can go and get a bunch of coffees before the base is fully loaded. So using a timer is unreliable for this case. Using the sync is completed is reliable. The first time you launch your experience, you will get as long as it takes to download all the content. And then once the content is cached, it will get shorter. If my voice volume changes, it's normal. I have my friends' jet fighters flying around above me right now. Sorry about that. I'm next to an Air Force base these days. I knew they were going to come during the webinar, of course. They had to. So using the sync completed, first time it will take as long as it takes to download the whole content. Then when the content is cached, actually on my case here, if I go in this sync completed and I remove this timer here, so as soon as the sync is completed, I will hide the loading layer and play the video. If I hit play in my scene, it's gonna be, should be relatively instant. And the video is here and the video is gonna play. With the screen sharing, maybe, yeah.
It was relatively quick. In lieu of time, I would like to ask, while an experience is running, can you just talk briefly about how synchronizing works after launch? If I make a change in the base and I publish that change in the master, what happens on the experience side? Do I have to call that to force a synchronization? That's a whole other Q&A topic, I understand, but just briefly for the audience.
So briefly, as we have these triggers, we also have an action, which is general action. Of course, I have the biggest space we've ever created for us. Sync local base. That's the action I was looking for. So you can manually call this action to force a synchronization. Now, again, it's a whole other topic. So in a nutshell, either you have something like time-based. Every morning, I want to sync my base, or every hour, every 4 hours, which I'm not a big fan of, because remember, you're creating interactive experiences. Maybe somebody's using the experience when you're actually trying to do that sync. So not a big fan of that. I'd rather do something like every 4 hour or every whatever time frame you need, set a flag, like set a global variable needs sync to true. And then when your experience comes back to the attract screen because a user has ended using the experience, actually call that sync. It's a little bit better to me. The second option is you need something on demand to be able to be triggered from your desk, your office. That's where I would add a web trigger component to the experience. From your desk, you call our API, and yes, we will have some ways to do that directly from within the Headless CMS user interface at some point. But as of today, you need to use the API or create a button in your browser, something like that. Call the web trigger, send a message to that experience, hey, you need to sync. Again, how do you process that message? Option 1, you directly call the sync. That's risky if somebody is using it. Option 2, you set a flag. When the experience is back to its attract, you actually do the sync. That's a good topic for another Q&A.
Yep, it would. In fact, I thought we talked about something. We got to check what we did in previous Q&As. I thought we touched on the trigger.
We touched about the web triggers and using web triggers in like a bookmark in your browser. Not yet how to combine this with the Headless CMS, but we're building all
we have more of a comment than a question, just saying that we know when the synchronization is finished. We don't know its progress, what percentage. I'm not even sure how much we do know, but yeah, be a nice idea. But today,
Mike, I cannot agree more with you. And believe me, I already created the ticket for our product team a few weeks ago. So they know.
All right, moving on to sliders. So this is Seb's last topic of today's Q&A. I'll have the final. This is talking about how do you create something separate from a collection that lets you manipulate that collection, to slide your way through it, for example. Go ahead, Seb.
All right. So first of all, the collection we're going to manipulate here will be the scroll collection, not the asset grid, not the asset flow, just the scroll collection. I will touch base on why. Second, you might know that with the scroll collection, the only scroll thingy we have is a scroll indicator. So don't look at the red dot just yet. This black bar which appears and disappears when I'm moving. And as the name suggests, it is a scroll indicator. It is not a scroll bar, meaning if I release this, it disappears and I cannot drag it. I'm actually dragging the collection itself here. So yes, it is in our roadmap to improve this and make it easier to be customizable and to be a true scroll bar, not just an indicator. In the meantime, because this is not going to happen anytime soon, as far as I know, how can you create something that follows your scrolling or that you can drag around like a scroll bar, right? So I'm just showing it here, the ugly one, to explain the mechanisms. and then you will see that this is fully customizable and that can be as fancy as you want. The magic formulas, I'm going to come back to these because they will explain how you actually build this scroll bar. So in a nutshell, we use a second scroll collection and we bind the horizontal offset in percentage, and that's super important, to the horizontal offset of your main scroll collection. This binding makes the red thingy move when the scroll collection is scrolled. So we're going from the top to the bottom. And at the same time, we bind the horizontal offset of our media collection to our slider horizontal offset. So it's a loop. Basically, a few months or years ago, you try to build that in interface that would cause an infinite loop, which would maybe crash. Doesn't. This has been fixed. And so now this kind of a cross-reference looping binding is allowed and does work in Player for Windows, in Player Next Gen. How do you build this thing? So you need basically at least 3 elements. So what I'm going to do here, this is for reference. I'm just going to put it on the top here, and I'm going to build a new one to show you the steps because it's not that long when you know the magic formulas. So first of all, you need a scroll collection. This one here is 1,000 pixel wide. Your slider does not have to be the same size. If it is, it's a bit easier, but it doesn't have to be. So for easiness of math, I'm going to do 1,400 pixels wide. Okay, so that's the size of my slider collection. The second thing you need is a kind of cursor. So you could use a shape, you can use an image. Actually, I'm going to use this one, which I had prepped here. And I'm just going to make sure. So that's the live demo scroll bar collection. And I'm going to put this one here. What's important here is the size of this image, this cursor. I'm going to make this a bit bigger. So we actually go with, again, simple math, 100 pixels. All right, so that's my cursor side. This is where comes the formulas. You need something to use as a background, and the easiest is to use a background rectangle, which will give you the scroll area, if you will, for your cursor to make sure that it doesn't go outside to the left, it doesn't go outside to the right, but it can go from the left to the far right. The formula for this rectangle is your scroll collection width, 1,400, times 2, 2,800, minus the cursor width. Should be 2,700. I'm going to just put something like a light reddish thing. Then the second thing is your background rectangle exposition. So where do I actually put this rectangle in my collection? Is collection width 1,400 minus the cursor 100, so that's 1,300 times 2 should be 650 if I had enough coffee this morning.
Divided by 2.
650.
I think you said times 2. You mean divided by 2, right?
My bad. Divided by 2. Me zoom in here. Yep. So we had 1,400 minus 100, that's 1,300, divided by 2, that's 650 for the exposition. Now, if I were to just do that, and I'm actually going to do it just to illustrate, if I actually bind my collection to the media scroll, actually make sure I have the right one. Yes, horizontal offset percentage. If I just do this, you will notice that it doesn't scroll, it scrolls within the same direction. Although when you have a cursor like this, you want it to scroll the opposite, which is kind of weird. But when you're on the left, you see the first media. When you're on the right, you see the last media. So when your media collection scrolls to the left, your cursor should scroll to the right. It's at 8 a.m. in the morning, it can hurt a little bit, but that's where a custom scroll bar is. So you could use converters and do some more math, right? But there's a much simpler way. Just rotate your scroll collection and then rotate your cursor. That's the easiest thing to do. Once you've done that, just make sure your cursor is to the left. If we try again, we are moving the scroll collection. So I'm at the far left here. My cursor is at the far left of my slider scroll collection. If I go to the far right, my slider is at the far right. And that's where using percentage instead of pixels is helpful, because now I don't care that this media collection is 1,000 pixels, this one is 1,400, because it scales up. We are using percentages. By the way, when I built that the first time with Ryan from support, we've been working on these formulas to make them as simple as possible. One of the key things we did was to put a text here and to actually display this horizontal offset. This is the kind of debugger thing that really helped us, with our brains trying to understand, okay, what exactly are we trying to achieve? What do we want the value here to be when this is, and actually we want the same values. When this is 20%, we want this to be at 20%. The last step, so what we did here, when I move the media, the scroll collection moves. We have a scroll indicator, nice. We want the opposite. So if I remove this binding on my media collection, I want my horizontal offset in percentage to be bound to my live demo scroll bar horizontal offset in percentage. And so it looks okay. I need to remove the elasticity and make sure this only scrolls horizontally. And we have a newer scroll bar. Of course, the rectangle in the background can be invisible. You can have any kind of image, static, with some nice curvy shapes, whatever you want, right? But the logic is a scroll collection that goes from 0 to 100, and you bind them side by side. Now, of course, if I try to move this one, this doesn't work anymore because I changed the binding. You can use only one scroll bar, which hopefully makes sense. That's about it. So scroll collection, these three formulas. I will post this in community with a sample. So you have a reference. I mean, there's always the recording of the webinar, but having these three simple lines should be all you need to create this custom slider. All right, time for questions. I believe we may have a few on this topic.
I just think it's pretty friggin' cool. I really like the rotating 180. I was thinking of all of these different ways, and I go, oh, just flip it. It's
honestly, kudos to Ryan on this one from support, because I had done this in the past using custom script converters that would do a minus full size minus x equal blah, blah, and that was so complex that sometimes it wouldn't work, especially on the older player for Android.
It's awesome.
This is much simpler.
Very nice. And I think that when you understand the principles of this, it might open your eyes to doing completely different design techniques, but it opens people's eyes, I think. It expands their understanding of what you can do, because Intuiface isn't a programming tool, but you can still create algorithms in a way. You can manipulate things in real time and calculate things. You can still do that to some extent, and people, that's a walk run kind of thing, where when you're a beginner you don't even know that. And this is a great example of how you can do it, so it's really nice. There was a question, although it goes back to debug. We're going to get back to the debug question later, so we'll get to that. Go ahead, Deb.
I said kudos Ryan, but say kudos Ryan and Louis, who joined us a couple of months ago, because I believe some of this is also coming from him. And thanks, Paolo, thanks for the math. I know you always like things where coding is not involved.
Yeah, that's really cool. Very, very cool. And by the way, could this be a design accelerator? Could somebody kind of pre-package this in some way so it's at least partially reusable?
Actually, I have a brand new PC, so I don't have it here. But I used to have my slider gauge, which was like a rectangle, and a blue cursor, which was pre-built with this kind of math, which I was using a few years ago to control the Nextmosphere lighting. I was actually using this from 0 to 100 to change the intensity of the lights on my Nextmosphere boards, and then to change the saturation or the hue, I don't remember. Any value, numeric value that you want to change from a lower range to an upper range, basically you can use with that. And the advantage of, by the way, oh yeah, one quick cool thing which you might want to like. If you use a gauge, a linear gauge, I'm gonna take the most idiot example probably I could use, temperature, right? I'm gonna rotate this here. And this gauge, I can buy my value right now, they go from -20 to 60, which, okay, I don't care. I want to go from 0 to 100, and I'm gonna bind this to my scroll bar, horizontal offset. Now, have a designer make this longer, bigger, again, change the design. Hopefully you get the idea that you can have your scroll bar being as custom as you want using the linear gauge below your cursor, and you can create some pretty nice things.
Awesome. So
linear gauge is a good way to help the visuals here.
Open some eyes. Why don't you give me control looking at the time? Let's make sure we can cover the last topic. And again,
yes.
Tis, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We'll get to your question at the end.
So definitely, it's a good one. I'm making you presenter.
Please, yes.
Yes. And getting the question box for me.
I want to make sure I'm showing the correct screen. And let's confirm. Yep, looks like you all see the correct screen. Yes, great. All right, so this diagram exists to scare people into understanding how much you can actually accomplish with Intuiface. We call this the architecture. It's actually a simpler version of this. This is more of a build slide that tells a story about all of the different aspects of content creation, deployment, management, measurement that you can accomplish with Intuiface. All the way on the bottom right, if you've been with Intuiface for a long time, what Player Next Gen has introduced in particular is that stuff on the bottom right, the ability to deploy to the web and as an app. The as an app is really a web variant. It's what the industry calls a progressive web app. It is entirely web technologies, but it can run sort of outside of a browser. It looks and acts like an app, but it's really the same thing that would run inside a browser. Progressive web app. It's not an Intuiface thing, it's an industry thing. This ability to deploy experiences to the web also gives us this ability to deploy them as a progressive web app. So Player Next Gen introduced this capability, which raises a question, how are we going to license that thing? Because it's different conceptually, at least the way one typically thinks of websites. I'm creating something that an indeterminate number of people might be able to see and put on in their browser. Is that licensed like Player? You know, probably not. Are there scenarios, however, where it's a finite number of screens? It makes sense to be in the web, but I know the number of screens. Should it be licensed like any other website? Probably not. Should be different. So we had a lot of discussion and ultimately came up with two options for licensing when you deploy to the web. We call them views licensing and player licensing. We're going to talk about both of those briefly here. You need to choose which one makes sense for your project when deploying to the web. If you're using Player Next Gen to run in Player locally on a device, on Windows, BrightSign, Samsung Tizen, etc., forget views licensing. It's just traditional player licensing that you've known forever. We're talking specifically about deploying to the web. You choose between views licensing and player licensing. So let's break it down. Why would you choose one over the other? So maybe the most significant determinant of which one you choose is, do you know how many people are going to be viewing it? Or put another way, how many devices are going to display it? If it is an unknown number of devices, you do not know in advance, which is a typical website. You publish something to the web, it has a URL, and however many people view it is however many people view it. When it's an indeterminate number, you need to do views licensing. Why? Because if you do player licensing, you need one player per screen. So if you don't know how many people are going to view it, you don't know how many player licenses you need. And unless, look, we'd love for you to buy 1 million player licenses just in case, but it probably doesn't make financial sense for you. You're going to want views licensing, where what you're essentially purchasing are the number of views. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So if you don't really have a finite sized, well understood audience, then you really should be going with views licensing. If it's finite, then maybe you should be going with player licensing. There are some other considerations. So let's keep going on. With views licensing, media is downloaded on demand or progressively downloaded. It's downloaded when it's required. If I have a video on scene 3 and I'm on scene 1 and I'm using views licensing, that video is not downloaded until I'm on scene 3. Like a typical website, it downloads it on demand. It downloads it when it's needed. When you do player licensing, it's a preemptive download. Everything is downloaded up front. So just like that HCMS-based synchronization we talked about, the first time you launch it, it's got to do a sync. With player licensing, it's the same idea. The first time you launch it, everything is preemptively downloaded for a very good reason, which is the ability to run offline, which we'll talk about. So there's a very good reason for it, but be aware. If you're doing player licensing, there's going to be a big upfront, well, it depends on how much content there is and your network connection, but everything will be preemptively downloaded, whereas with views licensing, it's on demand. It's when it's needed. If it's a video, maybe it's a progressive download. So it acts more like a typical website. Because we're preemptively downloading with player licensing, you can run offline. If you're player licensed, it can run offline. You do not need a network connection, just like if you're using the Headless CMS. That local-based copy lets you go offline. Same thing with player licensing. The media itself is all proactively, preemptively downloaded. You can run offline. With views licensing, if you're offline, stops working. Okay? It's going to say, oh, you're offline. You got to reconnect. Again, works more like a traditional website. This notion of running as an app, progressive web apps, that needs to be player licensing. It has to be. Again, the presumption is it's a finite number of uses. It's a known number of people, of devices that will be running it as an app. Player licensing, you cannot use views licensing if you want to run as that kind of standalone progressive web app. And finally, if you're using player licensing, you can force the release of that license. If under the covers I delete the URL associated with that deployed experience, that forces a release of the licenses as well. When you're using views licensing, when it's checked out, it's checked out. You got to wait till it's freed up. Okay? And we'll talk about how it's freed up in a moment, but you have no control over that. With player licensing, there is something you can do to say, no, I want the licenses back, right? So hopefully this helps you differentiate when you would pick one over the other. There are still some additional details that I think just maybe to help you understand how things will operate and how it differs from one license to the other. The main difference is, do you know how many devices? If you don't, got to go with views. If you do, player licensing might make more sense. So let's talk about those additional details. From a SKU perspective, what are you buying? Well, with views licensing, it's a bundle of 1,000 views. That's what you purchase. It's a bundle of 1,000 views. And as you'll see in a moment, essentially you get 1,000 views each month, and then for each calendar month, it resets to another 1,000 views. So it's an annual license giving you 1,000 views on a monthly basis. With player licensing, it's the exact same player you're using in Venue, the exact same one, same price point, same everything. In fact, the player license you might use to run it on a Windows device will also allow it to run in a browser with player licensing. It's the exact same license, the same licensing model, the same everything. So if you understand that model, you understand how player licensing works. It's only views licensing that is new. What does it cost? So each bundle of 1,000 views, 3,600 US, 3,300 euro. Again, that's an annual cost. That 1,000 views refreshes on a monthly, calendar monthly basis. You can, of course, buy more bundles if you think you need to support more views. Player licensing, those numbers on the right, those are not new. That's been our pricing since we launched in 2FA 7 a couple of years ago. So that's not new. Again, it is the player that also runs on BrightSign. It also runs on Tizen, all of them. Scope. So when we talk about views for an Intuiface account, it is not per deployed experience. It's across all deployed experiences. All deployed experiences for a given Intuiface account are sharing that bundle of views. You do not have a bundle per deployed experience, which is pretty important because, by the way, the same experience can be web deployed with different URLs. You could have multiple URLs for the same web deployed experience. It would be awful if all of them required their own unique views bundle. That's not how it works. So no matter how many web deployed experiences you have, no matter how many URLs you have, they're all feeding from the same bundle. On player licensing, just like when it's running locally on a device, it's per device. Every device running a player license experience in a browser or as a progressive web app has taken a license. Okay? So every device will have its own license. You can think of those licenses as coming and going. If a license is released, and we'll talk about that, if a player license is released, it's back in the pool, and somebody else can take it. Whereas a view, once it's gone for the month. You cannot replenish during that month unless you buy more. The player licenses, they kind of float. They can come and go from a device as needed. Views licenses, they're just gobbled up for the month and then reset in the new calendar month. When is a view consumed? There's some nuanced details, but to simplify, it's when you load. Every time you load an experience in a browser, that's a view. Every time you reload an experience in a browser, that's a view. And every 20 minutes, it's being displayed in a browser, that's a view. It's every 20 minutes. And as I said, you cannot retrieve a license for a views license experience. It's just running in a browser, and every 20 minutes that it's open, it's going to take another view. Simple as that. Again, there's maybe some subtle nuances that we document online, but that's the gist of it. Loading the web page, reloading the web page, and every 20 minutes, a view is consumed. Nothing to do with player licensing. This is about views. Same thing for the views reset. I've mentioned this a few times just to reiterate. Every calendar month, you start over again. You get back all your views. So you start counting down from the total number of views again. On the player licensing side, we call it a retention duration. Remember, it can run offline. It's taking a license, and then you assign a retention duration. How long will it hang on to that license? If an experience is player licensed in a browser, and then the device goes offline, that experience will continue to run until the license retention duration has expired. That's unlike, remember, views licensing, you're offline, or stops. With player licensing, it'll go until the retention duration has expired. When it's expired, the player license returns to the license pool. The experience on the offline device will just stop running. It will say that I no longer have a license if it's still offline. If it's online, it will say, all right, is there another license available? I got to give this one back, but is there one that I can take? So it can be smart that way when you reload that experience. And this retention duration is very configurable. It can be as little as 20 minutes. It can be as long as 30 days, whatever makes sense for you. I'm going to give you, I guess it's kind of a demo. I mean, it's a pretty simple thing, but I just want you to see what it looks like in a browser. By the way, that's the user community. Seb mentioned the user community. You all should be a member of the Intuiface user community. Here we are in the Share and Deploy console, where I manage my published experiences and all of my deployed and licensed players. We have, for example, the Intuiface overview experience. When we have a sales call, we use this experience, and it is deployed to the web, not from this account, but it is deployed to the web from an Intuiface account. For any experience in an account that is platform enterprise, got to be platform enterprise, any Intuiface account that's platform enterprise and has access to Player Next Gen will have this fifth tab, deploy as web page. If you don't have platform enterprise, you're not going to see that tab. If you don't have access to Player Next Gen, I don't think you're going to see that. You might see it anyways. Player enterprise, I'm not sure. Platform enterprise, I'm not sure. But if you're platform enterprise and you're Player Next Gen, you're going to see deploy as a web page. For any experience, you can deploy as a web page. For those of you working with Player Next Gen, you might know there are some limitations that remain. In Player Next Gen, the list gets smaller and smaller, but it does not feature comparable yet to the current generation of Player. So maybe not every experience is web ready, but you could technically publish any experience. This particular experience is definitely web ready. Let's say I want to deploy it to the web. Well, look, the first thing I have to do is pick which kind of license. Do I want to use Player licensing or do I want to Views licensing? You need to know the answer to that question before you can even deploy. You can't decide that after the fact. Do I want to use Player licensing? Do I want to use Views licensing? If I don't have a Views bundle, this won't be available to me. If I don't have Player licenses, this won't be available to me. So the Share and Deploy console knows what licenses you have and will then make those available to you. So you choose whether you'll use Player licensing or Views licensing. We've done a nice thing here. We've given some explanation for each licensing option, sort of a reminder of what I just discussed with you. And then at the bottom, you can create a URL. And it's out of the scope of this webinar and time. So I won't go through the URL creation process, but it's pretty identical, whether it's Views or Player licensing. The only difference is, well, I guess I'll show you that. If I create a URL for Player licensing, see where my mouse is? There's retention duration.
Jeff, if I may, we already quite over time and almost over the extra time we allow ourselves, and we have a couple of questions.
I know. They can wait. Anyway, as I said, that was just to give you kind of a look at it inside the Share and Deploy console, but hopefully you understand the difference. So let's go to the questions. If you read Scott in advance, go ahead.
Yeah, so a question from Scott. What if I get a hard hit with 1.5K views in a month, but only anticipated 1K views? 500 will not be able to view. That's not true. Do they get an error message? No. What if I want to add view licensing before the end of the month? Jeff, I'll let you answer this one.
So certainly you can always add additional views. Yes, you can add additional views. There are bundles of 1,000 and you can add more bundles.
We are not doing a hard limit, right? So we are not stopping access to the experience.
Currently, we don't even do a hard limit. We let you know when you're hitting the limit, but I think we are very loosely enforcing the limit currently. So I think it's a bit of an honor system, I think, currently. But if there are if you don't have a license at all, well then yes, you're going to get an error that says I can't run this thing. But if you do have a bundle and you exceed the capacity of that bundle, we know it. We're going to let you know we know it, but we're not currently enforcing it. But don't count on that lasting for very long. When we do enforce it, we're going to give you a heads up. Typically, what we do is we give you a cushion so you can kind of go past that limit a little bit as we give you warnings. And then if you hit the limit, then it'll say, sorry, this experience is not accessible. I don't know that we'll say it's a licensing problem. We'll just say it's not accessible. So that's how that would work. Is there a limit for the number of simultaneous viewers when using Views licensing? No, there's no limit. It could be 1,000 people at the same time. It could be one person watching it for 20 minutes times 1,000. It's there's no simultaneous at all.
Yeah, and remember, all our Player Next Gen and the experiences deployed on the web are relying on the infrastructure that we have, which is based on AWS. So it is quite scalable.
Yeah, we had another webinar yesterday talking about our ability to embed Intuiface and third-party CMSs. I hope you were there. And we talked about that a little bit, the AWS infrastructure that helps improve deployments globally. No matter where you're located, we try to store all the content as close to you as possible in the AWS infrastructure and the cloud deployment network, the CDN. All of content deployment network, so all of that should help maximize performance as well. I know Seb and I can stay, so we are at the hour, but we can stick around. I don't see any more questions. I certainly want to encourage people to ask them. If you have questions, you can ask us anything. While waiting, for those of you in Europe, just be aware that our COO, Vincent Oncont, will be in Munich for Digital Signage Summit Europe. He's got a few talks, and you can meet with him in person. So in case any of you are local or intending to be local, I wanted you to be aware of Vincent's presence next week. Okay, so again, I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, for those of you who are still here before you leave, this is the first time we let Jeff talk in the Q&A and address one topic. Do you think we should do that? Or do we think
I want to point out that Seb's portion, Seb spoke for 48 minutes. I want you to know that. I had 12. What about the joke? Yeah, I guess I should have.
Don't start about that.
Yeah,
Don't start about that.
I got a bunch of good dad jokes. Let me see if I can think of any of them. Oh, here's one. They say that cats have 9 lives, but frogs actually have more lives. You know why? Because frogs croak every night. Does that even make sense in French, that frogs croak every night? Does that make sense?
I don't think so.
In English, to croak.
So I don't get it.
Well, what a frog croak is the sound they make. Ribbit, or whatever the French. That's called when frogs croak. But to croak is also to die. So it's a double meaning word. So they croak every night.
It's not an international joke.
Mike is laughing his ass off. It's very funny.
Mike. Don't encourage him, please.
We still have a few folks. Any other questions about anything whatsoever?
Actually, yes, we had a question from Thais.
Oh yeah.
Which I completely forgot. Sorry about that. So I have a button which has 10 triggers because of different if statements with multiple actions underneath the triggers. Then it would be great to be able to name the triggers to have more clarity in my projects for debugging purposes and quality of life purposes. I'm with you on that. So when that happens on my end, because it happens sometimes, especially when I deal with Nexmosphere and I have RFID tags and 8 tags do 8 different things. You do have 2 options. One is on your interface set, you create your 8 triggers. Each of the triggers are calling 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 actions. And that's the kind of nightmare you're talking about. Yes, it would be great if we could put some labels or notes of comments. We don't have that. So what I do in the meantime is I have my 8 triggers, but in front of each trigger, instead of having 20 actions, I actually call one action, simulate a tap, on a button, which I put in a layer or an experience layer, and then I name my button, like tag 1 lifted. So the name of the button becomes the name of the trigger that you're kind of looking for. And on that button, I put my 3, 4, 10, 20 actions that I need to call when this particular trigger is raised. So I use the buttons as a proxy, which gives me that naming possibility. So I hope that answers your question and that gives you some ideas. We actually got a new one from Mike. When could it be possible to save data to HCMS out of the experience? It's like writing in Excel, but writing in the Headless CMS or doing a post in a table. I don't have the answer to that question. Question being when. I don't know.
Again, I think the question is when can you write to the Headless CMS rather than reading from it? That's, I guess, the question.
Yeah. I think so.
No idea.
And no idea.
Certainly on a roadmap, it's not earth-shattering idea yet. We know, but certainly complex, and I'm not familiar with the roadmap. What I suspect might come first, by the way, would be an API, so you can read from it using something other than a two-phase. That probably is coming before writing to it.
In the meantime, though, because I had to do something very similar recently, and I went back to a table. That was the easiest for me to write data into an online cloud-based kind of database.
By the way, if you want to save data, use analytics, right? So if the
That's
goal is
another.
to,
Yeah, it really depends on what we're talking about. What kind of data?
yeah. I mean, if you just want to retain information for offline use, use analytics. Not media, but any text or number-based thing you could store in the in analytics. Oh, Seb, it's the same number of people, so either they stop paying attention or they're all waiting for more questions. So we'll stick it out maybe another minute. If anybody else has a question, now's the time. I'm going to put a clock on this. So I got my watch. Oh, what's this? Go ahead, Seb.
Question from Scott. Sometimes I don't see the deployment of an experience from the share and deploy console screen preview. So I end up having to either restart or reboot before I see the update. I would suggest you open a ticket with support, because when I use it myself, like for trade shows, I don't have that issue. I was walking on the floor at Infocom installing my apps, my demos on the LG booth and using the share and deploy on my phone and being in front of the kiosk, and I could see the update on my phone like real time. So that's the last time I used it, which was like 2 weeks ago. So yeah, let us go through support, give us a bit more information, and we come back to you about that.
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know, when you deploy experiences to player, then in the share and deploy console, you can see what's running on that player. There's a screenshot essentially. I guess Scott is saying he doesn't always see that; it just stays blank, I guess. So yeah, that's not good. Shouldn't be an issue. Allocation of free views to enterprise users. Yeah, it's by saying, "May I please have some free views, Paulo?" And we say, "Sure." Yeah. I do not believe that Platform Enterprise comes with free views, but I'm sure that your sales rep can be accommodating and gives you some. That wouldn't be a problem.
Jeff, you do know that we are 10 minutes late for another meeting we're supposed to be in, right?
But we're speaking with customers. And this is priority. All right, but we are 10 past. I think it's fair to call it. So, Seb, as always, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you
you
guys for being
much.
here and for sending so many questions. I hope these topics keep being interesting for you. If you have questions you'd like to be addressed in the next webinars, again, don't be shy. Send them to support, send them to community, send them to me directly if you prefer. If you want to send questions in French, you can always do that. Will we have an evolution of CMS with drop-down lists? Yes, it's called the enumeration field. It is in the roadmap, but no, I don't have an ATA on the release for that. Sorry, Jean-Luc. And yeah, I think that wraps the session for today.
Have a great summer. We'll post the recording online when it's ready. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, guys.
Have a great day, guys. Bye.
Adios.